We continue with the legendary rocks piece as we find out so many things about Jabach, his crew, but also so many other secrets, including his connection with the legendary pirate Davy Jones, who we already know had some secret relation with Emo in the past, as well as many more details in this once again incredibly dense chapter of One Piece. So, let's not waste any more time. We pick up from last time as Loki talks, with Rocks referring to him as a chibining or chibi humans, which interestingly is a similar term to what Harald used to refer to humans before, either held him change of them. However, Stusy finds his remark quite cute. Within this shot you can see just how much white beard towers over the lot of them, and in his back he carries a naginata, hence the belt around him, which might even already be his famous Sayuono Supreme Greed, the Murakumogi. Loki, however, refuses to bend to Jabag's demands, but Jabag instead hits him with his sword, likely what cut the mountain in half last chapter, unable to injure even someone as strong as Loki, who couldn't die from falling from the sun world. We see the sword cracking with lightning, likely an indication of Conqueror's haki, especially with what we see later delivering an attack so powerful that the narrator describes it like a giant hammer causing an explosion. However, when he assumes this pose, it looks incredibly similar to that of Roger about to perform his iconic attack. But even further, the sound effect around him is pi. Usually, the sound effect for crackling haki is that of body, which represents the sound of cracking thunder in Japanese. But in this case, it's with a harder P sound, almost as if the cracking were even more intense than normal, showing just how powerful his haki is. During this scene, we also get Jabek's own unique laughter, which is Vaha. As we pan back to the 1468 level of 56 years ago, we see the moment when Jabek had infiltrated Marihua, but shockingly, he made it farther than anybody ever did. Not before and not since, managing to infiltrate the flower room where King Emu resides, managing to meet the elusive king face to face. Jabek and Emu stand next to each other on opposite ends of the room, though neither are unbothered because they both realize they cannot take down the other. Jabek clearly realizes that Emu is far too powerful and likely even immortal to be taken down right now, whereas Emu likely realizes how powerful Jabek is, that he is not someone anyone will be able to easily kill here without letting him escape, even if Emu did probably try. Shockingly though, there's a third party. In this room, a veiled woman, seemingly serving as Emu's attendant. We saw a similarly kneeling attendant in the first appearance of the flower room when they came to inform Emu that the Gorsei had gathered in the empty throne room. But while they had a female voice in the anime, it's hard to say if this was the same attendant we see here, as the individual here clearly appears to be Gonko. The heterochromic eyes are undoubtedly the same, with the only difference being having a longer hair. Though surely the mark doesn't stop the God Knights from shaving their hair. At the very least, though, it makes perfect sense that it would be a God Knight who is serving the king directly, as he are those who already have witnessed Emu's existence. I do have to wonder if this is explicitly Goko though, or how she got to this position, as obviously she's perennially youthful, but we did see her as a child alongside a younger Brew. The thing is though, while Brook did die 50 years ago, 6 years after this level, he had already been a pirate for quite some time, so the two could have grown up together just briefly before Gunko became a servant to Emu here. While we're on the topic of Gunko, I'd like to mention something very quickly that you may have missed, and it's the fact that in the latest volume release, Gonko's title box was updated, changing it from simply God Knight Gonko to Saint Manor Goko, while Shamrock also similarly got his Saint Tel too, a Sane Field Girl and Shamrock, debunking any theories that they did not have titles of sainthood. The Man-Mare family was already previously mentioned during the God Valley incident by one of its members, which was fighting in the genocide tournament. As a reminder, male celestial dragons use the honorific C, which means saint or holiness, while the female celestial dragons use the honorific Gu, used for female members of the Japanese imperial family, which you could translate as saintess or lady. Ivankov claimed that during the Void century there was an individual called Saint Neona Emu, indicating that the Neona Emu of that time was seemingly male. But there's always the possibility that Emu may have swapped bodies across the ages, such as with Lily or others, or even surpass such notions by becoming an immortal devil. So it's hard to see what their current sex or gender even really is. Jabach simply declared himself as being a worshipper of Davy Jones, with a term used suhisha, meaning worshipper, or adorer, used to refer to a person who you worship so much you almost view them as a deity. Now this name is very interesting and we'll get to it in just a moment. But Jabach simply leaves Emu with one threat. I'll be back right here. A threat that is essentially telling Emu that one day I'll be back for your throne and I shall become the king of the world. As we glance one final glance at Emu, we can see their veil fluttering. Though this definitely seems to indicate this isn't hair, but rather a veil worn over their head, just like the one Gunko is wearing. Very much one and the same. As you ran out, though, he ran into Harald, causing a clash between the two. Evidently, both are using Conqueror's Haki, as the loud cracking of body thunder cracks can be heard to the point that neither of their blades are even touching. So powerful is this clash that it literally eradicated every person in a 5-kilometer radius, which 5 km seems to like overkill on this part, given Mariju's size as we've seen so far. But the term used here is that of Sata, which literally means erased or wiped out, evaporated, implying that not even bodies were left behind, as we see nothing but air surrounding them, where before there were cumless soldiers and celestial dragons. And the ghast is also powerful enough to fully extinguish the fire on Harald's body. Quite frankly, I think this might be a contender for the strongest clash we've seen in One Piece thus far. Harald, with Jabach in tow, decides to escape to the New World by literally leaping off the red line, which may seem insane, but considering that his child survived a fall from the sun world all the way up into the clouds, he falls straight into water may be survivable, if only to these two insanely powerful individuals. The crime of infiltrating Marijuan, having killed a marine admiral, instantly made Rox famous, though this claim seems to indicate he was not that well known beforehand. We get a glimpse at his bounty poster, though sadly the bounty number is cut off, only able to see the final 3 digits. Given the space they take proportional to the bounty poster, it seems that the bounty includes at least 9 digits, of which I'd expect no less, of course. But it's also possible that it could be 10 digits, so it's hard to say if it reached into the billions or not. Most striking, however, is his pose in the bounty poster, as it's fairly identical to that of Buggy's bounty poster, once again reinforcing people's theories that Buggy may indeed be Jabach's child, with Roger having taken in both the baby of Garling and the baby of Shebk. Sometime later, though, Rox would raid a government ship carrying Heavenly Trivet, which was seemingly traveling through the Tai Current. However, the Tai Current cannot be escaped without someone opening up the gates of justice. So, Jabach simply destroyed the gates of justice to escape, a feat that is insane if you remember the sheer size of those gates. However, following this, Jabach set his sights on building a pirate crew, particularly through the ancient pirate tradition of the Davy Back fight. And this is where the aforementioned statement of worshipper of Davy Jones makes a lot of sense. As a quick history lesson, I'll let Robin explain after she was asked about the origins of the Davy Back fight. There's an island out there in the sea considered to be a paradise for pirates. They call it Pirate Island. On that island long ago, a game was born. It is said that to get their hands on the best seafarers, pirates would use this game to steal other pirates. Davy Jones was a pirate from long ago who had been cursed by the devil to live in the depths of the seafloor, where it is said he yet lives to this day. Or so the legend goes. All ships or treasures that sink to the seafloor would become his possessions, as both swain as they would sink into his locker. Davy's name is associated with possessing all that sinks. So pirates called stealing others from your enemy as Davy back in the SPS Oda further repeated the myth with some slight more detail, referring to it also being a legend in our world that is very similar, describing it as there once was a lying no-good pirate named Davy Jones. He was a greedy fellow, famous for shutting his crewmates' belongings and treasure and such into his own locker. Even for a pirate, he was a bad guy. And one day, the devil cursed him to live forever on the seafloor. Since that time, whenever ships, sailors, or treasures sink into the sea, they end up shutting his locker on the seafloor and never seen again. That's the legend. I would have further also provided a doodle of Davy Jones, though hard to say if he meant this as the real-life myth of Davy Jones or the one in One Piece. However, what if this isn't a legend, but in fact the reality? What if the pirate Davy Jones that future pirates would be inspired by was in fact a real individual who lived in the past of this world? After all, the legend makes mention of a certain entity, the devil, a being who we now know is very much real. In fact, being the king that sits at the top of the world. So, what if Emu at some point in the past cursed Davy Jones by making him sink? Or perhaps a more realistic interpretation, what if Davy Jones was caught in the second calamity and sank alongside the world? Is there any validity to Davy Jones yet being alive? Or is that the more fantastic part of the tale? And furthermore, we really need to ask ourselves the question, was Davy Jones a yet unseen individual? Or could he maybe even be Joy Boy himself? Well, the description of him being a really bad guy, if anything, seems to beat him more as a Rox-like figure opposite of Joy Boy rather than the man himself, but it's hard to say for sure. Regardless, it is clear that Jabach declaring himself as a Davy Jones fan to Emu left an impression on the king, as Emu may have been responsible for sinking the original Davy Jones and thus may see Jabach as someone coming back to avenge him. However, this myth led to many years later the development of the pirate game Davy Back Fight, a game that developed on the pirate paradise that is Pirate Island. Kaizukujima, translating to Pirate Island, is also known by the alias of Kachinosu, translating to Beehive, a name which was said to be an interchangeable alias. In much the same way, the Island of Justice is also the equally known by the name of any lobby. So either Hachinosu or Pirate Island are both valid names for it. And of course, this is the island we've seen many times later on, but we'll focus on that in just an instant too. Jabach clearly admired Davy Jones quite a serious amount. So, it's not surprising that he would partake in a lot of Davy back fights. This was something that was already largely assumed by fans given the association Jabach was said to have with Pirate Island in Chapter 967. This is actually similar to Foxy's backstory from his Vicard, where he was a failed boxer having lost his license due to having been found cheating on the ring and was lost for several years until he became fascinated with the myth of Davy Jones and the Davy Backfight. We see here Jabach partaking in several of those Davy Backfight games, including one of boxing, referring to the final combat game between Luffy and Foxy at the end of their Davy Backfight. We also see several bounty posters flying through, including one for Edward Mugate, though the bounty is too blurry to see, and another unknown one, though it looks a lot like Don Marlin from later in the chapter. Through these fights, Jabach accumulated an impressive crew of 6, which he brought to Aura's castle with him to meet with Harald. Jabach wants Harald to become his nakama, but Harald is trying to find a way to collaborate with the government without having to join them and wishes to opt for a more peaceful path. As we see him talk more and more across this chapter, we can see that Jabach's speech pattern is actually not that far removed from that of Blackbeard, sounding like a gruff pirate. However, we get a proper introduction to his pirate crew composed of 6 of which seemingly Whitebeard, Shiki, and Stusy were his closest men, as they were the ones seen with him the most last chapter, which makes sense as they go down in history as the most infamous ones. Without any need for introduction, we have of course the first and foremost the pirate Edward Newgate, known in the future as Whitebeard. We know that he set as a pirate in his youth before he even had a mustache in hopes of finding a family, having lost his as an orphan of Sphinx Island and evidently was gathered by Jabach as a result of a Davy back fight. Next is Shiki the Goku, known in the future as the Golden Lion or Kenishi. The epithet Gokudo is a very complex Japanese term, as breaking it down it meets the extreme path, but it generally carries a meaning of pure evil or a wicked soul. So you could translate it as something like Shiki the Evil or Shiki the Wicked. However, there's more nuance to it, as the term Goko is fundamentally a synonym for the underworld or organized crime, particularly used as an alternate word to refer to the Yakuza in Japan, the organized crime families. And this is fitting as Shiki does carry a Wano-esque attire, and we've seen him behaving like a Yakuza boss before, particularly during his ceremony in Strong World where he exchanged sakazuki or sick cups with his underlings to welcome them into the family, a tradition that is particularly common in Yakuza families. Shiki, of course, would go on to become a legendary historical figure, becoming one of the most prominent figures of the era of Roger alongside Whitebeard. Following is Miss Buck and the Science Robber, or known by her full name of Buckingham Stusy. The epithet of Science Robber or Kagakuto in Japanese is actually quite fitting, as we know that after the fall of the Rocks pirates, Stusy would go on to freeload with Mads, the clandestine team that was composed by Viapunk, Caesar Clown, Vinsmoke Judge, and Ken, later known as Queen. So, it makes sense she's not only involved with science, but also took advantage of it. Furthermore, Sty claimed later in life to be Whitebeard's lover, claiming that Weevil is indeed Whitebeard's child, even making the claim that Vegapunk could prove their relation, which has led many to wonder if Weevil could be the result of some cloning experiment or something like that. The following individual is someone new, being Don Marlin, known as West Blue's gang. His epithet makes it very clear that Marlin is associated with the 5 great families of the West, referring to the 5 criminal gangs that rule the West Blue's underworld. These families would each be at odds with each other, but were particularly thrown into chaos when a young muscle man by the name of Capone Bez began assassinating the heads of the organizations, eventually becoming a family leader, earning the epithet of a gang. He continued to take down rival heads, but had no interest in their territory, only valuables and the satisfaction of taking down the king piece of rival families to cause them to collapse. He eventually grew tired and set out to sea to the same as a pirate. As such, it makes sense that Don Marlin may have been a previous influent figure of the five great families, as he seemingly had the original epithet of a gang. So, Beige may have actually been given this title after Marlin by inheriting his epithet. It's also possible the two may even be related, as Beige is 42 years old, but who knows? Marlin's own name is likely derived from the actor Marlon Brando Jr., who was famously known for playing the role of the mafia boss Vito Corleone in the iconic film The Godfather, fulfilling an iconic cinema role pretty much identical to that of Don Marlin. Ironically enough, Beige's own crewmate VTO would also inherit this name of VTO. Similarly, B is obviously named after Al Capone, while the five great families are inspired by New York's five families which ruled its underworld. Coming up is Oku, the founder of piracy. His epithet, Kaizuku Kyo, is another quite nuanced epithet, as the term Kyo is one that refers to the founder of a religion or the pioneer of a religion. Some may translate this as the parrot guru. But while the term guru did occasionally refer to a religious founder or expert, I feel these days this term has largely been twisted to simply refer to an expert in their field in a way that I feel it doesn't quite carry the same nuance as it does in Japanese. Especially as the Japanese dictionary definition likens the term Kyo to individuals such as Jesus Christ or the Buddha. Fundamentally, this epithet treats like the founder of piracy almost like a religious messiah. But this is likely not meant to literally that he invented piracy. What with Joy Boy being the first pirate, but rather as a figure so influential some treated him like a religious messiah that helped found piracy into what it is today. Of course, the name Uku should sound familiar. He was mentioned as one of the most famous men of Jabach by Sengoku all the way in chapter 957, finally making his debut after 6 years. His name Ultu is derived from the Japanese version of the name of real-life famous Chinese pirate Wang Ji, who is known as Ultu in Japan, combining the kanji for king and straight, which is why you might see some translations using the name Wang Ji. But let's be very clear canonically in One Piece in Japanese. He's known by the name of Oku. As we know and are reminded here as well, would eventually become the leader of Pirate Island. Though this chapter precises, he would have the title of Toku or Admiral, which is the same title Blackbeard now holds, which makes sense as this seems to refer to the ruler of Hachosu. For clarity, this is not the same admiral as a marine admiral, which is known as a taisho, but rather referring to a pirate admiral. As unfortunately in English, there isn't as much distinction between these two terms as there is in Japanese. Oku would seemingly rule over Hachosu after Jabag's death until Blackbeard would eventually take power during the Rocky Port incident during the time skip, dethroning Ao and becoming Admiral of Pirate Island himself. Now, the fact kept this position for who knows how many years shows he was clearly a fearsome pirate. Interesting as well is also his appearance, as he looks like a Draculian vampire, making him incredibly reminiscent of King Siki, the ruler of Lulucia, as Lucia is similarly inspired by Romanian Dracula, which makes me wonder if Ao has any native roots with Lulucia. More than anything though, his appearance is clearly far more similar to that of Caribou, with his eyes, mouth, tongue, nose, and pointy ears all matching quite similarly. The fact he was treated like a religious leader also might connect with Karu's claims of praying to a god. And the fact that Caribou has now joined with Blackbeard strengthens the connection between the Roxu and of course now Blackbeard. And finally, we have Ganzui, the smuggling pirate. His epithet of Mitsuyu Kaizoku, or smuggling parrot, is a pretty self-explanatory. Well, the name Ganzui is written just like that in Japanese. So, it's most likely it's romanized like that, though hard to say if it really means anything, as the closest connection is sounding like the transliteration of guns, but that would be without the I. He's a figure we've seen before, though, as he was seen not just among the Rocks pirates in God Valley, but also as one of Moria's zombies alongside several other crew members, likely having perished during that incident. Many assumed this to be Old Shuku for a very long time due to the similarly long beard, but it's clearly not the case now. Beyond these Spurs Sikhs, we do know in the future that many other famous pirates would join the Rocks. That includes, of course, Sherlock Big Mom Lin and Stronewather, Kaido, Captain John, Gloriosa, and seemingly Shaki too. According to the most recent SBS, Gil Baster, the protagonist of one of Oda's oldest one-shots, also became a member of the Rock Pirates, similarly becoming later a zombie in Thriller Bark. But it seems the version of him in One Piece is slightly different, as he had 4 arms, ones which he kept until his death as a zombie. So, they're seemingly not Deford related. Beyond him, there's also an individual known as Gimu, which translates to silver axe, though that might be an epithet and may potentially be the zombie with a big silver axe seen among the other general zombies. Anyway, going back to the conversation, they explain that Hachosu, which as we've mentioned its name is interchangeable with that of Pirate Island, originally started as a penal territory for which it was known as Exile Island or Rukima. It was treated as a deserted island where the world's worst criminals from many different countries were sent to in order to starve when no other prisons in the world could handle them. This makes sense as visually Hachosu appears to be a very arid summer island. However, once a gold deposit was found there, surviving pirates bonded together and worked with an underworld organization to attain great wealth, eventually building on Hachosu, a lawless pirate country. Jabach thus planned to negotiate with the government for retaking Hachosu in exchange for a large sum of money.
However,
He doesn't plan to hand it over,
Instead,
becoming its leader to turn it into a pirate paradise. The same term Robin used to describe it back during the David Back fight. A plan that is very much like Blackbeard's later plans, like infiltrating Impel Down. And once he does, he plans on annihilating the Marines, destroying the Holy Land, and attain his ultimate goal. I'm going to be the king of the world. A term eerily similar to Luffy's own declarations. This is a dream that was already stated by Sengoku all the way back in chapter 967, where Jabach's ambition was to become the king of the world, or fundamentally to take Imu's position. These declarations, however, impress a young Loki who looks up to Jabach when his father didn't. Unfortunately though, while Loki did request to join Jabach's crew, as we very well know, he would later be beaten up and ignored, having to abandon such a dream. As we skip 4 years later, or in other words, the year 1480, 44 years ago, we're at 6 years before the God Valley incident as Jabach sets his grand plan in motion, taking control of Hachinosu and finally establishing the rock spirits. We'll have to see though if we do continue seeing things from his perspective, or if instead we'll simply go back to Loki now that Jabach has refused to take him in. At the very least, if we don't hear of God Valley again, we'll see Loki's reaction through the news as he was aware of it. The chapter closes with the editor note of the legend set sail, which lands a lot with last chapter's claim of the legend appears. This statement seems fairly reminiscent of the claim Oda made of the lurking legend, a figure which Oda described with 3 traits: that the figure would appear or be mentioned in some form during the year of 2018 in the manga, that the figure was somehow potentially connected to Whitebeard, and that the Straw Hats would one day face this figure as their strongest enemy yet. The only 2 candidates for this position of lurking legend would be either Rocks or Emu. The connection with Whitebeard seems to connecting more to Jabach, but on the other hand, the Straw Hats facing him seems odd as he should be dead unless she comes back in some form, or even perhaps as some part of him still exists to this day as Marshall D. Teach lurking as a legend in the shadows of this world.